I'm so pleased to have these wonderful presenters with us today. So we will not hesitate and get started here. Just a little bit about who the Grandfamilies and Kinship Support Network at Generations United is. We are the first and only National Technical Assistance Center on kinship and grandfamilies. We use those two terms interchangeably to mean grandparents and other relatives and close family friends who raise children when parents can't. We provide an array of assistance types, including these kinds of webinars and learning communities. And you'll see a link there to our events page. Will take you to all the past webinars that are recorded and all the future webinar offerings that we have. We have an extensive library of resources that are yours to use and disseminate. And they are all available in our resource library on our website, which is there at the bottom. We do individual assistance. So if any of you have any questions about services or supports or kin-specific licensing or whatever, we have a form where you can ask your questions, and if the technical assistance specialist that we have on staff can't answer it, we have a whole cadre of subject matter experts, including the wonderful Marina Nitze. So with that, I will turn it to her and all these fabulous panelists who will introduce themselves when they start talking. So Marina, it's my pleasure to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here, everybody. And I think Ro will run my slides. Thank you. And before we start the panel, I'd love to give an overview of kin-specific licensing, how we got here, what opportunities that creates for us, and then we're going to have a panel for the majority of today. And again, excited for your Q&A. You can jump ahead to what's changed and why. Great. Okay, next slide, please. So, where did we start with foster parent licensing? I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but for a very long time, a state or jurisdiction's foster parent licensing process had to be the same for relatives and for non-relatives. And most jurisdictions chose to have some variety of waivers, non-safety waivers, that would allow some case-by-case exceptions, but not very many. And what this meant when we looked at the data was that the vast majority of kinship caregivers who had placement of children in their home were not licensed. And that meant they were not getting foster care maintenance payments in most jurisdictions. It meant they were not able to access daycare. It meant they were not able to access respite. So they had children they were caring for. As we all know, kinship caregivers are 2 to 4 times as likely to live below the poverty line. They're trying to make these placements work, and they, in many cases, lacked financial and other supports because they couldn't get through licensure. And we considered this a bit of a warning sign because foster care maintenance payments are tax-free income for, again, caregivers that have children in their home. So it indicated that there was some reason why relatives were struggling to make it through a process, despite having already been approved as a safe placement for the child. So we wanted to close that daylight and that gap between being safe enough for placement and to maintain placement potentially for the entire duration of a case until we get permanency, and the requirements for getting financial resources, daycare, and respite. Next slide. And in December of 2023, in response to basically universal feedback from states, from private child welfare agencies, I think there were 170 comments on the Federal Register draft rule saying, hey, there is a good reason why jurisdictions should have the ability to have a separate set of standards for kin that are not less safe, but that reflect the unique needs of kin. And I'll give you a couple of examples here. It doesn't make sense to hold a relative who has placement to an income standard to have a minimum income in order to get a foster care maintenance payment, right? That maybe makes sense for a variety of foster homes to make sure that they have sufficient income to maintain their household. But if we've already placed a child with that relative, it doesn't make sense to withhold licensure and withhold foster care maintenance payments because they don't make enough money. That doesn't make sense, right? Another example that came up quite a bit was flexible sleeping spaces. It may make complete sense for a 17-year-old to sleep on their grandma's couch. It doesn't make sense for a 17-year-old to sleep on the couch of a family that they don't know. So these are not safety differences. These are differences just simply recognizing the unique situations of kin and kinship caregivers. So, as of December 1st, 2023, Title 40 agencies have the option to have a kin-specific licensing or approval, or some places call it certification as well, process that recognizes the unique needs of kinship caregivers. Next slide. So the federal requirements for what this means is that a state's kin-specific licensing, approval, certification, whatever word they want to use, they have to be reasonably in accordance with the recommended standards of national organizations. And we're going to talk about that in a second. And then you have to fulfill federal background checks. And I do want to emphasize these federal background checks remain the same for kin and for non-kin for all foster homes. They have not changed. Next slide. Oh, sorry, one more. That was me emphasizing that the safety requirements have not changed. And so a bunch of child welfare organizations came together to make the new model standards for kin-specific licensing approval certification. Here's the whole list. It includes many of the crew on this panel. And then next slide. So the kin-specific model standards, again, include the required background checks. Those have not changed. And they include a kinship-specific caregiver assessment that includes a safety assessment of the home. And the key I want to emphasize here is that we worked with every single state, Title 40 tribe, hundreds of subject matter experts, hundreds of kinship caregivers and families, and really tightly modeled the kin specific standards on existing, long-standing kin placement processes. So if you have seen the recent information memorandum that came out from ECF, I believe last month, the goal is that you should get 100% certification, licensure, approval, whatever your term is, within 7 days of placement with kin. So that is generally a much shorter time frame than you're looking at for a general foster home. And again, this is because the kin model standards are very closely aligned to the placement process. So we are trying to close that gap between assessing for safety for placement and for being able to remain for the duration, and then being able to access benefits like foster care maintenance payments, respite, and other resources. So in that 7 days, generally speaking, with the model standards, you'll conduct that safety assessment, which again, everybody was doing already to make a placement with kin. So we're aligning to that with some flexibility for kin only. And by flexibility, I mean we want to help support closing any gaps that that family has. So rather than say, you are safe enough to place, but we're not going to license you because you didn't meet this physical environment checkbox. Instead, it says, what do you need? What support do you need so we can close that gap and we can fully check that box and meet that standard and then get you licensed. Next slide. So I just want to highlight this was a map of where we co-designed standards. So we took everybody's current placement process with kin. We took all the forms and then kind of took the best of every state and put them together. So this shouldn't be a new, unfamiliar process. This is really based on existing practices. And we took, again, the best practices that we could find in each place, pulled them together into one set. And then we consistently tested them. We went out with families, with workers. We tried them out. We made sure that the language made sense. We have recommended form templates so that, all the yeses line up and all the nos line up. So it's not, it's not meant to be a trick question. Really thought through with public health experts. As an example, a thing that we discovered was many jurisdictions had a requirement that you had to lock up all medication. Well, when public health experts saw that, they said, wait a minute. A kid with diabetes or asthma or a severe allergy may need access to their inhaler, to their EpiPen, to their insulin. And so we refined that requirement to say you have to lock up medication unless a child is authorized to have access to their own medication. So, those sorts of uh, flexibilities that are designed to enhance safety and meet families where they're at. Next slide. So our expected benefits from kin-specific licensing is 100% equitable support for kinship caregivers who have placement. We should not have kinship caregivers who have placement of children who are in custody of the state who are not getting the same financial supports that a foster home that is not kin would be getting. We hope to see more kin placements as a result of that. We also hope to see more kin guardianship because, as you may know, to access subsidized third-party guardianship subsidies, you need to have been a licensed foster home for the previous 6 months, consecutive 6 months. And so if you were an unlicensed kin with placement even for years, you didn't hit that 6 month mark and you weren't eligible. And so that was a missing benefit as well. And also we heard consistently from private agencies, from public agency staff, that some of those steps they were doing before were not high value. They want to spend that time, and that's what we're going to focus on today. They want to spend that time providing higher value, higher order supports to families and children. So that's really where we want to focus. Next slide. And then just quickly, I wanted to just again double click on the idea that the background checks, fingerprinting, et cetera, those have not changed. So it's federal requirement that you do a fingerprint-based background check and you check the child abuse and neglect registry of any state where the caregiver or any adult living in the home lived in the last 5 years. That remains the case. And next slide, we also added practices that everybody was doing anyway, which is checking the sex offender registry and doing a name-based in-state background check. So I think this is a myth that I really want to bust. We did not remove any background check requirements for kin in the model standards. Next slide. Yes, and then this is there is still a list of federally disqualifying crimes. This list has not changed either. If you have one of these crimes on your background check, you are not eligible for federal financial participation in foster care maintenance payments. Generally, this means that you are not uh, ultimately approved for placement, although there are some states that will make some case-by-case exceptions for this and provide state funding for the foster care maintenance payment in very, very unique and rare situations where it still makes the most sense for that kin caregiver and that child. Next slide. And I just want to highlight that we've made incredible progress nationally. Over half of the country has adopted kin-specific licensing so far, and every single Title IV agency has publicly committed to do so. So we are on track for 100% of Title IV agencies to have kin-specific licensing and approval. And so that's really what we want to talk about today, or what all the opportunities are that presents to provide even greater and better wraparound supports for families. And one more slide. So what's not changing? Background check processes remain the same. We did not remove any safety standards. We did remove a number of red tape administrative burden type steps that did not make sense in the context of a kin caregiver. And as mentioned, we added flexibilities so that agency can meet a family where they're at, provide additional supports, and meet the needs that they have. As an additional example here, we heard a lot from families that had placement, were approved for placement for years, but because they lived in an apartment building and they couldn't control the fence around the apartment building's pool, or they couldn't control the hot water temperature of the heat provided to the whole apartment building. They were approved for placement. There was a safety plan in place to make sure that, there was no access to the apartment pool, and yet they weren't able to get licensed. So we wanted to add those flexibilities. So with that, and I'm happy to answer any questions in the Q&A later if folks have questions about the kin-specific model standards, but I would love to jump to our panel. So next slide, next slide. And with that, I'd love for our panelists to introduce themselves in this order. Oh, nope, it's fine. Scott and Leah, how about you go first?
Sure. My name is Scott Batson. I am the Vice President of Foster Care and Adoptions with Arrow Child and Family Ministries in Texas.
And I'm Leah Wilson. I'm the Director of Kinship here at Arrow Child and Family Ministries in Texas.
Rebecca and then Erica?
Rebecca Boccia-Fern, Licensing, Recruitment, and Training Supervisor at Children's Hope Alliance in North Carolina.
Hey everyone, Erica Burgess with Burgess Consultative Group.
And Allie.
Hi, I'm Caliendo. I'm the founder of Foster Kinship, which is Nevada's Kinship Navigator model, and we're also in the clearinghouse.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much for being here today. Again, please, folks, drop your questions in the chat. We're excited to cover them. But I have some questions to start off with. So some of your agencies have already implemented kin-specific standards. What changed operationally once this went live? And Leah and Scott, I'll look to you first.
I would say one of the first things that we did whenever the standards dropped is that we implemented, we went through a crosswalk of all of the new standards and all of the contract standards to make sure that we truly knew what was going to be required for us. And then we did a deep dive into everything that we did and said, is this actually something that is required, or is it something that we've just always done, right? And that took a big shift change, I think, within our agency. But through that, we were able to reduce our training pretty significantly for kinship families. And we were able to use that reduction in training to also make it more specific just for kinship. And that was huge. We were also able to reduce a lot of the paperwork requirements. And there's a lot more flexibility, like you mentioned, Marina, about sleeping arrangements, how many kids that you can have in a home. And that was huge. We have a lot of kinship caregivers where aunt or grandma is sleeping on a couch, and that was previously required variances and all sorts of permissions. And it just makes more common sense, right? The families are living in multi-generational homes and things like that, that it makes it more kin specific. So I think that was some of our biggest changes, but even just smaller requirements like if they're married but they're separated, not having to get a separated spouse who's never hasn't lived in that home for 20 years and things like that. But it was a big overhaul, I think, within our agency, but we were able to really kind of drill it down to what's actually requirements, or what's an actual requirement, and make it easier for these families and for our staff ultimately too.
I'll also add, in Texas, we have our license with HHSC, then we have a contract with DFPS or the single source continuum contractors. We were a little, I don't want to say disillusioned, when they rolled out the minimum standards and we did that crosswalk Leah talked about, because we had minimum standards, contract standards, and then we are COA accredited. So we're making sure like what matched and what didn't. There were still a lot of things within contracts with DFPS that were still a barrier, that still didn't match. So we were still going to be held accountable in those contract standards for audits and those types of things. So luckily, what was it, probably Leah, 3 weeks or so ago, they did release contract standard updates. So they did kind of go through and start matching some of those standards, but there's still some in there that are contradictory with each other.
Yeah, and I think as agencies have started to really drill that down, it's also been able to help us inform, contracts and licensing too, on like, these changed, but this didn't change. Have y'all considered this? And I do think that advocacy is starting to make a difference. Like, we're slowly seeing certain things get taken off the list.
That is a great example of something to look for in the future is so the kin specific standards are there. We worked very closely with the COA to make sure that the COA accreditation is exactly lined up. But yes, it could still be in your state contracts, and that's going to be a process to work through. So that's a really, really great flag. Allie, what was it like in Nevada?
So as we were preparing for this to come down, one of the things that we're aware of is, states can do, if they're able to do their own thing, they may do the model standards, they may do something a little bit higher. And so we wanted to make sure that Nevada heard from our caregivers on what they wanted. And so as we were going through it, we did a very similar crosswalk with here's everything that we're currently required to do. And then we interviewed through survey and through pilot groups a lot of caregivers who had gone through the licensing process and those who hadn't. And we asked them what had genuinely helped them, what felt, unnecessary, and what if they were in charge, what they would require future kinship families to do. And the results were very interesting. Obviously, a lot of the things that we all agree were unnecessary, caregivers were the loudest about. They also really felt like they needed support in certain areas and they didn't want to lose that support. So we're able to take that feedback and work with the state in a bunch of working groups on how it was going to be actually implemented in Nevada. We also had an interesting dynamic where we moved forward very quickly as a state to be approved. But then only one of our child welfare agencies, the 4E agency, runs the rurals and frontier part of our state, was moving forward on it quickly, whereas our two big metropolitan areas were kind of waiting for it to be codified. And so we had a dynamic where different parts of the state were at different places with it, but it gave us an interesting pilot of what does it look like when we move forward quickly. One thing I want to mention is, as Marina said, most states, and certainly Nevada, we were already placing with kin families at a very high rate. We just weren't licensing them because they couldn't meet the standards. So one of the things that we heard from licensing workers in our different departments was concern of like, well, if we can't license them, why are we paying them? And like this has been a fundamental question that we've had for decades, really. So I'm glad that we're talking about it now. But the placement standards have always been this way, and kids are already in these homes. And so it opened up that conversation. But the other thing is that money doesn't necessarily always just solve everything. Money is sort of the foundational first step that we have to do. But we know from research too that kinship families disrupt at higher rates due to things that traditional families don't, like the family dynamics within their family system. And so being able to knock out the money piece very quickly and get those basic needs met so that you can start focusing on what families truly need to stabilize, I think that's the biggest win here. And having those conversations of, well, what does a family truly need once they're paid to actually do this over the long term if that's necessary.
That's awesome. And I think something that you guys from the survey, I love that. I love hearing from them. And something that we'll talk about more today, but is an ongoing theme, is how much support did we require upfront and front load versus what supports can we continue providing? Can this give us the flexibility and the resources and the time to continue providing for the duration of a case? Because the support you need on day one may be very different from the support that you need at month 4, 5, 6.
Right.
Yeah. So let's talk about the kind of support your private agencies can provide for kinship caregivers. What wraparound supports have you built specifically for kin, and how, if at all, do they differ from what you offer non-kin families? And Allie, I'll just go in the opposite direction. I'll start with you.
So foster kinship has always only supported kinship families. And so we didn't have to modify anything. We were already doing it. But we wanted to make sure that as we're working through this process, we are being innovative and making sure we were getting ahead of, let's be honest, some of the fear of private agencies. If you have contracts with your child welfare agencies, there's a status quo of maintaining contracts for your own organization that feels risky when things change. So being able to be very innovative up front and go to your agencies and your contract partners and say, here's what we believe kinship families actually need. And once we can get through some of this nonsense and get that off the table, here's what we'd like to do instead. So being very proactive, and what we believe families really need at first is true sort of that hospitality, welcome, trust building, making sure that they feel very safe. Private agencies can be that bridge between what's required from our public agency versus building the trust with the caregiver so that they can take those steps. So I think it's critical. We also wanted to make sure we're reducing uncertainty for families so they truly understand what is happening to them and what they need. And again, these families are coming in fresh. They don't know what it was like before. So, saying, oh, it's so much better now, that doesn't hit. We have to just explain exactly what's happening, what's required, give all the options with ongoing support to make sure families have the best information to make decisions for their family, which looks different for every family. So we never want to impose something when they do have options. And then making sure we're walking alongside them for those bigger decisions along the way. So getting through this process, but then really our role is to stay with those families and to reduce the burden on our child welfare agencies by being that partner for families and making sure they have the support they need ultimately to offer generational healing services and those things that will really make a difference for children who are not able to live with their parents. And so that's the approach that we've taken with our agencies of, yes, we don't want to do this anymore either, but here's what we do want to do, and here's why it's even better for all of us and for these kids.
I love that. And while I have you, since you talked about kind of your rural areas moving so fast. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about what it looks like the kin supports in a more rural or an under-resourced area.
Yeah, I mean, it was always challenging. It was more so challenging when they couldn't even access licensing. And so with our rural partners, we worked really fast concurrently. We still have a training requirement. It's like 8 or 9 hours. So we worked very fast to make sure, how are we adjusting training for families so it's happening right away as fast as possible so that they're hitting that 8 hours and able to access that money very quickly. So we just worked really closely with our partners. Our licensing partners took over from sort of the placement side, and that's where we had some of the resistance because, placement was happening over here, licensing was happening over here, and now licensing is being asked to sort of do some of the things that they weren't doing before. So there was that fear of like, well, wait a minute, we're not used to being able to approve someone who doesn't meet these standards. So really it was about, okay, but here's what foster kinship can do for the families. What gaps are you seeing? And we're going to go ahead and be that partner for you and help meet those gaps so that we're all moving forward together. And just being creative in especially our frontier areas about how we get to families, how we're reaching families, using all the tools at our disposal to make sure families have access to information when they can't necessarily come into a big office.
That's a really great point. So Leah and Scott, tell us about the supports you guys have for kin caregivers.
I would say one of the things that we did, and we shifted to this even before the licensing standards came on, but we have staff that are specifically assigned to our kinship families as they are coming through the process in order to be an extra layer of support alongside them. And another piece of that too is we have internal behavioral health services. And instead of waiting until families are licensed to start accessing those services, we make those referrals pretty much immediately. And they can even access that if they choose not to get licensed for whatever reason. And so that at least they are leaving our agency with something, I would say, is just to they have got something in their pocket and somebody who is helping them there. But I think really for us, we had to get to a kin first culture across every single program that we worked in, whether that's from recruitment all the way until the end with our donors and then also with our case managers. And so it's been a big shift, but it's been amazing. And I think also we have some aftercare that we've implemented for kinship specifically as well, that is being implemented by our kin specific staff that are more trained on guardianship, adoption subsidy, and local kinship support groups and things like that. So that has been huge. But also just kind of to piggyback on what I said earlier, our training is now kin specific as well, as opposed to mixing them in with traditional homes where they have a little bit of that, but it's also nice for them to have that space where they're amongst their peers and we're talking about things that are actually relevant to them. And like Allie mentioned, some of those family dynamics that you might not have with a traditional home, like we can talk that through. It's just a different challenges, but different things that we can offer to them.
Can you talk more about the 6 months of post-permanency support that you provide? Because I
Yeah.
love that story.
Yeah, it's actually it's an exciting shift that we've been able to have because historically at Arrow we have not been serving families after. We're getting them to the end, whether that's to adoption or to guardianship, and that's kind of where our role on the CPA or our child placing agency side ended. But now that we're providing 6 months of aftercare for kinship's families, that has been huge and we've learned a lot. And so after they either adopt through foster care or they take guardianship, our kin specific staff are the ones that are continuing that aftercare for them for 6 months. So they are doing check-ins either on a weekly or a bi-weekly basis, kind of based on what their needs are. But some of the things that we have learned from that is, kinship families are so excited to have everyone out of their lives to a degree. And then when it happens, it's like I went from having 10 people in my house every month to crickets and not knowing where to go. And so when things like my adoption subsidy hasn't kicked in, where are my guardianship assistants? We had an issue with the birth certificate whenever we adopted, like they don't know who to contact and it's so overwhelming. And so that's been a big piece of what we have learned and what we're helping them with. And we have tried to be proactive about really trying to prepare them for that transition, because not only is it a transition for the people that are in your home. It's also a financial transition too, especially if you were getting foster care reimbursement. It's a pretty big jump from foster care reimbursement down to adoption subsidy or guardianship assistance. So we try to connect with them within the months that are kind of leading up to that to just make sure that they're fully prepared for what that's going to look like and what's going to change. But just also be proactive if they have kids with higher level needs, that they know how to continue on with nursing services or ABA or behavioral health, and our behavioral health is able to follow them there. But we're there to be the person they can call when they just don't know where to go. So it has been a great buffer, I would say. And then we're also referring them to kin specific support groups throughout that process too.
I'll also add, in our legislative session before last in Texas, they passed Texas Child-Centered Care, T3C is what we call it. And so we became credentialed very early on, and we receive Kinship add-on. And so prior to T3C, we were very reliant upon grants and donor dollars to go in and help families become licensed to go in and repair things in their home and get them prepared for licensure. So now with T3C, we have a Kinship add-on, and it's like $38 a day per child. And so in the T3C blueprint, that money is to be used on helping families through that credentialing process. And to kind of give you an idea, in Region 4, which is the 23 counties up in Northeast Texas, in 2024, we spent $53,000 helping families to become licensed by going in. Have a family that we call them collectors, not hoarders, but we may have to pay for a dumpster to be parked in the driveway where we do a clean sweep of the home so that we can get everything ready for them to be licensed, to meet licensing standards. And that was in 2024. Now in 2025, we spent over $70,000. So that has been very beneficial as well for us to help families.
Yeah, thanks for adding that, Scott. I think before we were doing that, it was taking families so long to get licensed because they just couldn't afford it. Like the CPR, the fingerprinting, the fire extinguishers, all of those things. And like they're already caring for the kids. So like let's take care of those. That shouldn't be the barrier to them getting more assistance and more help. And so we kind of started with the basic level things, but then as we've gone through, like we've been able to help with some of the more higher level, like Scott mentioned, like I'm on a first name basis with a guy who owns dumpsters in that area and things like that. And but like Ali mentioned, working with rural families, that's very different than the challenges that you have with like more urban areas. And sometimes licensing standards doesn't necessarily recognize the normal ways that people live.
Thank you so much for those examples. So I'm going to look to Eric and Rebecca now. So beyond these wraparound supports and these even post-permanency supports, kin can be really valuable supports for kids with higher levels of need. Can you talk about therapeutic and IAFT level homes?
Sure. So first, let me start and say that we're in North Carolina, and North Carolina has not adopted standards, and we do not have a navigation system. And so we do have some challenges. And so licensure, and specifically therapeutic or treatment foster care have been helpful to build out a continuum. Okay, so we have historically not been licensing families. Our numbers were really low, and our numbers for placement were pretty low as well with kinship caregivers. And so over 6 years ago, Rebecca was a part of a project that we did and piloted therapeutic foster care or treatment foster care in kinship homes. And that was like a big thing for us because we were not actually placing at the rate that we needed to really leverage that. But by bringing this program in, we were able to really talk about licensure and the benefit of the needs of the children. So a lot of our families that we're coming across, they have children and young adults that have really significant mental health needs. We have grandparents or aunt and uncles or sisters and brothers that have young people that may have just transitioned out of a locked facility. And they might have been there and been in care for several years. And this family member is not aware of their diagnosis, of their treatment needs. They don't have the skill set to manage some of that. And so what therapeutic or treatment foster care does, it is a little more burdensome for licensure, right? You still have to meet the requirements. In North Carolina, therapeutic foster care is funded through Medicaid. So you do have to meet significant requirements. There is still, you can't waive that training. There's still a lot there, but it's beneficial for families that realize that they may not be able to stabilize placement if they don't have some support. So one, they get extensive training. Two, they get increased supervision and consultation and coaching with their private agency. So instead of monthly oversight, they get weekly oversight. And then the financial stipend is a lot greater than if they were to be in traditional care. So we did that for 6 years. Becky can talk a little bit about her experience with that. But we've also, when we were looking at therapeutic, we also have been teasing the idea of IFT, which in North Carolina is a step up from therapeutic foster care. So more training, more oversight, additional dollars, access to a team. And so for the past 6 months, we've been looking at how do we add that to the continuum for families that feel like they need that extra level of support. So again, we don't have all the other pieces like kinship standards and navigation. So we are building things around licensure. We recognize not every family will want to be licensed, and we do not force that, but just allowing families to have the opportunity to learn about therapeutic foster care, to learn about IFT, and then be able to make a family decision about, can we commit to this? Are the needs in our family that significant that we need somebody in our home, weekly or several times a week, and give them the opportunity to decide if that works. And I'll pass it over to Becky. She can share a little bit from her perspective as a licensing body.
You're on mute, Becky.
Of course that was going to happen.
There
I just
you
did make sure everybody was awake. So our agency is a little different than some of the other private agencies across the state. We have historically licensed all of our parents, kinship or otherwise, or traditional, as therapeutic foster parents. So that doesn't necessarily obligate them to accept, a TFC level youth. It does not automatically indicate that the youth in their home are going to meet that level of care. But what it does, it equips them with the same skills that all of our other parents learn during training. It helps them prevent, recognize, respond to crisis. And then it also gives them kind of a leg up on, because the needs of children change every single day. So when a child's in your home initially, 6 months down the road, it could look very different. So it's giving them the tools in their toolbox, that practical toolkit to be able to support the needs of the children in their home as they grow. So I think that's something that we do that is a little unique. It does mean that it's more training hours than some of our other agencies, but we recently adopted the NTDC training, and there is a kinship pathway. So we now have the option that for our families that really strongly don't believe that the youth in their home is going to need that higher level of care, we do have a shortened 15-hour training program. But for the majority of our kinship families, they're going through the same training that all of our other therapeutic parents have. And then they're also getting all of the same resources and the same supports. So they're getting, as to Erica's point, they're getting at least weekly in-home visits for support. And those visits, it's supervision for the foster parents, but it's saying, what can we do to better support you? I think historically, there's always an emphasis in casework on the child. But the reality is you need to have that supportive adult to be able to support the child. So there's a strong emphasis on, what do you need from us and as an agency so we can better help you support the children in your home. We do a lot of connectivity with community resources because we are very hands-on with our families. There's a number of financial funds through a grant that we have helping them with all of the things in their home. Some of the funds that were discussed earlier. Do you need help building a fence? But then it's also, it could be sports equipment, art classes, additional tutoring for the child. A lot of our kinship families don't have those additional resources to be able to spend on the child and enable them to get that community involvement. And then in our agency, we also have some unique programs. So we have a peer mentorship program. So those are our more seasoned foster parents act as a support for foster parents coming in. So for our kinship parents, who are just navigating this new world of kinship foster care, they have someone who can kind of guide the way, answer their questions, and really empathize on a level that us as staff may not be able to. So we have monthly virtual in-service training. We have a lot of different supports for our families. We do have the ability to help our families reach that IFT level if the child in their home does qualify for that level. We have not been there yet. None of our kids have qualified for that level, but we do have plenty of kinship placements who are TFC level, and we treat as TFC families.
This is great. So I'm hoping just to like tie all this together, our hope and our goal for this webinar that we had was that if you're a private agency that maybe right now works on a 60, 90, 120-day licensing process, now instead of chasing down those separation documents, right, Leah? Or instead of sending kin caregivers, which still happens in some jurisdictions, to an orientation to decide if fostering is right for you, which when they already have a child in their home, right? So that's a discordant experience. What can we do instead with that time and those resources? Can we build therapeutic foster homes? Can we do post-permanency support? Can we do more kin training that's on an ongoing basis? Can we provide more and higher order wraparound support? So I love all these ideas, and hopefully it's inspiring some of you that are watching this, whether now live or the recording later, to think about what those might be. So on that line of questioning, so now that it's possible for public agencies to complete kin-specific licensing steps much faster, what advice do you have about talking to your state partners about what you as private agencies bring to the table? Like, what does that complementary support look like? And Scott and Leah, I'll start with you.
Hey, you want me to go first, Scott? I would say that complementary support means that every partner kind of has their role, but we're also intentionally building on each other's role and not duplicating it. And so I think our goal isn't for more people to have and be involved with their families, but it's for like the right people to be working together. And so I think that having partnerships with, and I know they might have different names in different states, but kinship workers or kinship navigators and permanency workers for the kids, all of us partnering together so that we're all serving this home together is so crucial. So some things that we have done with some of our offices is that we have monthly meetings with our kinship workers and sometimes permanency workers as well to staff the homes to kind of give an update on where they are with licensing and how we can all be working together to best support this family. I think, our families come in and we might all have separate agencies, but they're experiencing this whole child welfare system together, not separate. And so we should be working together to try and best support them through that, is what I would say. It's better customer service and we can get these families through much quicker. And I think sometimes our kinship workers or our permanency workers have been working with these families for a while before they get to us. So pick their brains and get their expertise. They might have already built some of that rapport. And so I think that's just been hugely valuable for us as well.
Yep. And I was just going to say, if they could just push them a little bit faster, so they can get, we know sometimes they're not as concerned about the case management. They really need the financial help. So the quicker we can get a family license, the quicker that financial help can get there for them. And so if they can just right out of the gate, spend more time, I think, explaining to them the benefits of it and getting their buy-in so that they can start that process. And then keeping that open line of communication, not just with the kinship worker, but with all the parties involved. Because some of those people, the permanency worker, the kinship worker, the attorney, the CASA, they're quick to go out and help with completing paperwork or just giving them that little bit of push when they go out and do their home visit and all, so that they can keep them actively engaged in that process.
Yeah, I think when we all work together too and know what each other does, that I have seen less families take guardianship without benefits because we're working together, as opposed to if we weren't and they didn't even know that option. And so the longer that those kids are there and the longer that the case goes on, the less patient a judge is going to get on how long that kinship caregiver is there before they get licensed. And we hate for families to be taking guardianship or adoption without any kind of benefits. And so getting us all connected is just hugely influential for those families and prevents the kids, hopefully, from coming back into the system.
Yeah. So Erica, you had an idea that I love about an MOU for family finding and engagement. Can you share this idea?
Sure. So, for a lot of the agencies in North Carolina, they struggle to see where they fit in this equation with how things are shifting with kinship care. And so, licensing makes a lot of sense. It makes more sense to the child placing agencies, but licensing is not the only barrier here. Like I said, our rate was pretty low. I think 22% over 7 years ago of our young people were placed with kin. We're now at 33%. That's a pretty low rate. So we have to find the families, in order to license them. So I've talked to agencies about just testing this out. And so private agencies reaching out to the counties that they have strong relationships and offering small pieces of work. What I mean by that is, there could be a county that says we have these 20 children that we have not done any search and engagement for years. They're in higher levels of care. We really want to make an effort to find some family members or fictive kin to either make connections or to look at placement, either or, because I'm not saying search and engagement is just about placement. So either or, and make a small arrangement that you start testing out. What does that look like? Let the private agency lead that a little bit. They might have funding or could get grants to actually get family finding tools that they haven't had before. And so that was one of the suggestions I've made to agencies. So take that small number. The other thing is look at the children that you're currently working with. So your current kids that are in service, and let's say that there's a handful from a particular county or area, go to them and say, hey, I recognize these kids are in treatment or therapeutic foster care, but they have no next step. And so they can't be here forever. So what is your plan? And you might start talking and realizing that the efforts, just because of bandwidth, that there hasn't been any efforts made for that next step, that they haven't exhausted all resources. So those current young people that you're working with, add on to that work. It could be a small, you're already getting paid for the service that you're doing on a daily basis, but for that extra little bit, what would that look like to do, a couple of rounds and just show that there are families out there and start making the connection. The last thing I've shared with people is if that neither of those work and you don't have a county that's interested, you could take it upon yourself for your young people, especially these, and I shouldn't say young people, your young adults that know of family members, that know of fictive kin, and start talking and interviewing them, and then lightly start massaging that conversation with the DSS and saying, hey, we've talked with Johnny. He said he has a coach and we'd love to explore this more. What do you think? What could that look like? We have this software that we purchased and we'd like to just do this. So doing it in partnership, don't doing nothing in secrecy, but in partnership and having different levels. So I've tried to bring people along to say, just try one of them, right? Like you might not be able to do all of those, but try something because we have to make better movement. We have to have families, and we have to have families involved. Again, not just for placement. So our young people that are staying in care and aging out, like, it is really sad to watch a young person leave and they look around and you're their only connection. It doesn't have to be that way, and it shouldn't be that way. And I think a private agency could really help to impact that. And plus with the private agency, we're not as scary. Private agencies are not as scary to families. And I know that's always like the elephant in the room, but like DSS, public entities are scary because of some, past trauma, past involvement, things like that. And so let somebody lead who doesn't maybe seem as intimidating, and they're coming in just to open the door and offer connection and not pressure. So if you lead with, oh, did we find Aunt Susie? Yeah, we found her. And now Aunt Susie, can you take this child tomorrow? Like, we don't want to lead that way. So a private agency, I feel like, can massage that as well and start developing a relationship with Aunt Susie and the young person. And again, building connection that eventually might lead to placement if needed. But if not, it could just be a nice connection for that family. Sorry, Marina, I'm going to go on and on. So let me stop myself.
No. These are all great ideas, which is the whole goal.
Do you mind
And
if I add something to that? Is
please,
this
yeah.
okay? So at ERA, one way that we have done that is we've partnered with the Wendy's Wonderful Kids program through the Dave Thomas Foundation, and they are national as well. And it's doing just that. It is identifying kids that are available for permanency but don't have an option available to them, and they are doing that family finding and trying to find those kinship options. And so we've seen a lot of success between our child focused recruiter, who used to fall under our kinship team as well. Now we've kind of moved them over to adoption, but partnering with our kinship team when they identify grandma, aunt who maybe was explored 4 years ago and wasn't in a place and no one called them back, right? And now they are available, or finding that coach or that teacher or that previous foster parent that they had that didn't know where they ended up after they got into an institutional care. And that has been huge. And partnering together to best support them so that those kids, if it's placement, that's wonderful. But like Erica mentioned as well, that they have ongoing supports that they can call even after they've aged out. Just as many supportive and caring adults in a child's life is better. So it's been a great partnership. And we've used Seneca searches has been a huge resource that we've used as well to identify other people.
I love it. So Becky, I like as one more idea for something that agencies can do. Can you talk a little bit about how you're thinking about how to retain a kinship caregiver who has been successful to potentially take in children that are not their kin?
Sure. So I think, again, our agency is a little unique in that we have historically had our parents kind of go through the full life cycle of traditional fostering in terms of their training and licensure. But I think we have had a number of kinship families who maybe initially that we only license them as kinship and then later transition them to either family foster or therapeutic. And I think the key is really kind of having those early, very intentional discussions with them in a group of their peers. So they're going through training with more traditional foster parents, some of whom have never even parented before. And I think forging those connections and those relationships early on, being able to kind of share their stories, share their experiences, and really reiterating the need. You're doing this because that's, you're supporting your family member or fictive kin, whatever the situation is. You didn't necessarily wake up one day and say, and go out and look for a child or go out and wait for the intake coordinator to call you with a child. You did this on your own. What makes you think you can't help another child in need? So I think we're very intentional about engaging in those conversations from day one of training. And then as we're supporting those kinship families throughout the placement with their kin in their home, we're asking them, what do you think would make you feel more confident or feel more potentially successful in serving other children in the future? I think, really being transparent with them regarding their strengths and needs. Here are the areas we want to continue supporting you in, but look at all of these amazing strengths that you could offer to another child. We've had a lot of kinship parents that have said, I don't know if I could handle another child in my home long term, but I would love to serve as an ongoing respite provider. So that's been a really nice in between, particularly with our kinship families who might already have 3-4 kids in the home, but say, you know what, if Johnny's foster parents go on vacation, I'm your person. Call me, we'll help out for the week, whatever the situation is. So we've had quite a number of our kinship families who have transitioned to accepting children that are not kin or fictive kin.
Awesome.
Can
So
I, can I add to that,
yeah,
Marina? Because I
yeah.
think this is one of the huge opportunities, and we need to talk about it more with the reduction in standards, or not reduction, the separate licensing standards. We're giving caregivers a good experience from the beginning with the agency. And when caregivers are having a good experience and they're building that trust up front, they are going to be more likely to want to continue partnering in the future for something like converting to a traditional license or taking in children that they're not related to. In Nevada, we have, I think, a 66% reunification rate. So that is a huge percentage of families that have kids go back home and may be interested in continuing to work. And because we provided them a good experience up front, it's a like a conversion market that I think we should be talking about more, because kinship families are a great resource. And the other thing about, this opportunity, it allows private agencies to think so much more creatively. Instead of putting all our energy towards those licensing standards and getting families through these very burdensome process, we have started to be able to think about, okay, well, if so many families are reunifying fairly quickly within the first 6 months, how are we targeting and working with birth families and having kinship family, birth family, meetings and making sure that that reunification is really solid and the kinship caregiver remains a support for that child when they go home. And for those families that are approaching permanency, we've taken on, like Leah said, post-permanency support with our agency. So we're doing for KinGap and for adoption, all those families who are going to permanency. Those are the families that need the more intense training and the resources long term, using the relicensing lever instead of a licensing lever to target the families that are most likely to need the long-term support with training, and then providing, as a private agency, ongoing support for let's get families KinGap quickly, let's get them out of the system. But it's much cheaper to provide ongoing support through a private agency than it is to have that family needing and relying on our child welfare system long term. So there's a huge cost benefit argument that could be made by private agencies to our child welfare agencies. And I just encourage everyone to start thinking creatively about what's possible when we're not spending so much time with, TB tests and pool fences.
Well, what a perfect note to end this webinar on. So I'm going to pass it back to Anna to transition out, and then we will move to a Q&A where we've got even more questions for our panelists.
Thank you so much. That was fabulous. Such a great session. I got caught up and wasn't ready to pounce here on my slides. But just a fabulous discussion. I look forward to the Q&A that follows on the Zoom meeting link. So thank you all so much for that rich conversation. We are just let you know about our next event, which is a office hours, really more than a webinar, even though we categorize it as a webinar. And it will be on next Tuesday. Well, not next Tuesday, in a couple of weeks. With our subject matter experts from the Food Research and Action, from FRAC. Also, please stay connected. And as the team has put in the chat, request assistance at any time. We'll add you to our monthly newsletter list unless you tell us not to. And we have a very active LinkedIn page where we share the latest resources from around the kinship field. So please stay connected with that.